Welcome, folks, to another episode of My Life with Robert Burns. Jim Thompson and Douglas Mackenzie here again with another of our cronies from around the Burns world. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Douglas. Hi, everybody.
Tonight, folks, our guest is a professor from South Carolina University, Professor of English. He's also an honorary research fellow at Glasgow University, research into Scottish literature. Tonight, cronies everywhere, please welcome Professor Patrick Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas.
Nice to see you, Patrick. We always start these off, Patrick, with the same question. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, well, I'm a non-standard participant in this great series. I think it's a wonderful series. As you can tell, I was brought up and had my education, early education, in England. My father was a Scotsman, was an expatriate Scot. He was born in Edinburgh and he came south in 1929, just before the Depression. He was a doctor, but he'd been a conscientious objector in World War I. And although he was highly qualified, he found it difficult to get a foothold in the hospitals. And he went into general practice for the rest of his career. And he married, lived down in Lincolnshire and Grimsby for the whole of his career after that. I was born right at the end of the war, and I was educated first, locally, and then in Derbyshire, and in high school age, secondary, I was in Cambridge, and I left school early. I left school at 17, and I went and taught in Nigeria for a year, which was a good experience, but sort of unsettled me for other things. And then I was in Oxford as an undergraduate. And then I batted round doing school teaching for a year. And then I went to Leicester, which was a little university of about 2,000 students then, just starting having graduate students, really. And I was there for 3 years. I got a teaching job there for a bit. And then I moved to Edinburgh in 1970. My father was very pleased. He died the next year, but he'd seen me with a real job, a permanent job in Edinburgh. And I stayed there for 6 years because I met my wife and we married in 1973. And she was in Scottish studies. She was the other side of George Square from English. So I met a lot of the people from there and I read her books. And I developed both interests. That was just the time when Scottish literature was developing in Scottish universities as a separate field. I mean, there'd always been people who knew about it, but Jack McQueen and Ronnie Jack and Ian Campbell were building Scottish literature as a separate course, and she used to tutor for that. So I had all the books, and that was where I first read, for instance, Snyder's biography of Burns and used Kinsley's edition and that kind of stuff. Not because I was teaching it, but because she was teaching it. And then we moved to South Carolina in 1976. She wanted to come home. She's American. And we came to South Carolina partly because Grosh Roy was here. And I think he was anxious to have someone else with Scottish interests. And it had all the books for her work. And that's where we've been ever since 1976. Now, I've been back a number of times, but I've only lived in Scotland from 70 to 76.
Excellent. That was a very quick whistle-stop tour. Let's go back to the early school days. Were there any signs in your early school days that was the direction you were going to go in? You're going to go into literature?
No, I wanted to be an architect. I did art and I was good at history. And I got into university originally based on history, but I ended up reading English. I had a very good English teacher in high school, a good history teacher, come to that. And they didn't have architecture in Oxford. They had engineering, but they didn't have architecture. So I stuck with English. And there's a lot more jobs in English and history, or were in those days. So it wasn't a bad choice, right?
And were you a great reader as a kid?
Yep. And I did discover, even in high school, that I loved doing research on it all. I was taught by people who did research, and I loved that side of it, really. In Leicester, I was taught really very well the basics of doing research in history and literature. So I got a set of skills way back, which weren't specific to Scottish literature, but which have come in incredibly useful later.
And your trip to Nigeria, that was quite a leap. What do you say, you were 17
Well,
then?
it was the end of national service. My brothers had done national service. And when I was leaving high school, secondary school, the sort of thought was there were going to be too many people in university. And I was very young. And I'm not sure it was the right decision. I think I might have done better to go straight on and do that afterwards. But the thought was you could go there and you could go and teach. Nigeria had been independent about 2 years when I went. My brother was there during independence. He was in the army out there. But it was good. I taught English mostly, but I taught some history, world history, taught West African history. I read a lot of African literature when it was first, the early books were just coming out. Funnily enough, the schools were all founded by Scotsmen, we had a cook in the house, or three unmarried men living in the house, and we had a cook who cooked us a version of porridge every morning for breakfast. It was an interesting place. I did building. I'd wanted to be an architect, and the builder, the man who designed the buildings on the campus of the schools, went back to wherever he came from, I think America. And so I designed buildings. And until very recently, I could go on Google Maps and I could go do close-up and I could see the buildings I'd built. There were other people actually building who knew about building, but I did the designs.
Excellent. So that would be a little bit like if you go onto Google Maps, it's a bit like going and looking at your homemade Lego.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's a bit you go on the map and then there's a little figure at the side and you put it up and you can walk around the places. Later, I taught math in a tech school in Grimsby after college before I went back to do research. And the proper math teacher was on leave learning the new math. And so I taught the old math to the people who were there. And it was in this Victorian building, right? Old school. Most of the people were going to leave at 15 and were very upset that the school leaving age was being raised to 16. So a little bit restless with natives in the school. But it was a living and I saved some money for going to graduate work. But that building is completely decayed. You can go on Google Maps and I can walk around the streets and I can go there. It's a complete wreck, right? With warnings to keep out. And every now and then the local paper will have news that they've had another fire in it,
My goodness. And has it got a blue plaque on it that says Patrick Scott taught here?
No. It's all it's got is these demolition signs.
Excellent. And how about any other activities as you're growing up? Were you interested in sports?
Yeah, I played sports. I mean, we pretty much had to all the way through. So I played, and I went on playing into college, because I was in Cambridge, you had these small colleges, so they all field teams. And so I played rugby, I played hockey. In Nigeria, I cleared a rugby field. The word had gone out that they ought to have rugby as well as soccer. So I had this tractor and I cleared a rugby field, which was sort of fun. And of course, I stopped doing that later because really I was too busy. And now in old age, I regret that I didn't keep fitter.
Yeah, I know the feeling. So what was life like in Edinburgh?
It's lovely. A bit lonely when I first went up there because, you know, it took time to make friends, but I made friends. There were a lot of young people teaching in the university then. You know, it's got older now. There were a lot of young unmarried people teaching in the university. There was the old faculty club on Chambers Street. And that was sort of on my way between work. And I lived over in the new town the first year in the very cold flat in the top of a house in Drummond Place. And then after a year, I bought a flat in South Morningside. Someone couldn't sell one. Someone from another department couldn't sell one. And I got in the bidding and I got it for the minimum upset price. I paid £180 down for my flat in Edinburgh. Best decision I ever made in my life. £30 a month mortgage, which I could hardly swing on my salary then. But it meant that when I got married, we had a place to live. And when we left Edinburgh, there'd been a lot of inflation, and it gave me the money to buy a house over here when we came and so on. So it was a good
Tremendous.
decision.
So what year was that you moved over to the States?
76.
76, yeah, I remember you saying that. And why South Carolina? Is that where your wife came from?
No, she's from Northern Virginia and her mother was from Georgia. So it's sort of in the same quadrant, but Ross was here. The real reason was A, they had a job, and B, Ross was here. And we knew there was a Scottish Literature Library for her to work with. And they wanted someone in my specialty, so. And at the time, it was a very good university before I diluted it, you know.
And how did you find getting used to life in America?
Well, I'd taught at William and Mary in Virginia for summers before that, so I was sort of used to the setup a bit. You adjust to your jobs at different ways at different bits of your life, don't you? And well, she'd finished her PhD and I'd got tenured, which is a big career rank over here, you know, have you got a permanent job? We had kids, and once you've got kids, you bed down in a place. It's a good place to bring up kids.
So you've talked about your wife and kids. You want to give them a mention?
Yeah, my wife is Mary Jane Scott, who has a PhD in Scottish literature from the University of Edinburgh and published a book and then went on into other things. She ended up in criminal justice, in working for a police department, victim services. And my children, my oldest child is my daughter Nancy, who lives about a mile away and has 3 children and teaches in high school. And to my shock, has 18 years in teaching. She's halfway to retirement, you know. My son Thomas they both went to university here. And he went on to get a law degree at Stanford and a master's degree at Princeton, and is a lawyer in San Francisco. But he's been all over the place. They're both A, nice people, and B, very successful.
Excellent. And how is it being a grandfather?
It's fun. 3 of the grandchildren are in town. My son's daughter isn't. She lives in Charleston, and we see her regularly. He comes regularly, and we see her regularly. But they're good. 2 of 9, 1 of 6, and 1 of 3. And you know, because I'm near, sometimes I babysit and sometimes I carpool for the ones in town.
Very good. The reason Jim came on tired is that he's been looking after his granddaughter today. So,
all right. How old is she?
She's 2 and 3 months. She's 2 years, 3 months old, and we get almost every day of the week because our mum and dad are both working. And it gets to the stage come Thursday, I'm starting to run out of puff. I've got the answer to say. Fortunately, we've got her again tomorrow, and in Kilmarnock there's this weird sort of thing about Halloween. It's always the last Friday of the month.
Oh,
so he's now hyped about that. So it's good stuff though. It's good fun.
Yes, yeah. I've got mine my in-town ones tomorrow morning because their school's shut and my daughter is still working. You know, they both work, but I've got them first thing tomorrow.
Very good. Now, before we start talking about Burns, tell us a little bit about your interest in Scottish literature and some of the work you've done there.
Yeah, it started really through my wife, mostly, and through meeting people in Scotland and knowing people. I'd done a little bit before, but not much. And once I came here and was working with Ross, I did much more because there weren't other people. In Edinburgh, there were lots of other people who knew a lot about it, right? But over here, there really weren't other people. And when Ross went on leave, I taught a Scottish novel course, and I would always teach some, and there were the books to work with. And then after a few years, I started working with the library a lot, and eventually I moved over there to be head of rare books as a sort of second job. And one of the biggest collections was Ross's Scottish collection. And I worked with him on conferences, maybe 6 or 8 conferences to do with Burns and other Scottish authors, Stevenson and so on. And I did acquisitions as well. And we were sort of involved in each other's projects. I mean, he lived very near. He lived about a quarter of a mile away. So I used to go over regularly. And he'd learnt Burns from his grandfather. And to some extent, I learnt Burns from him, you know.
And with the exception of Burns, who are your favourite writers?
Well, I started off in Victorian literature, and I'm very much a Tennyson scholar, right? I mean, I have a lot of interest in different authors, and I taught 36 different courses, so I taught a lot of different authors over the 50 years. But like Tennyson, I like Clough, Say Not the Struggle Nor So Vaileth, that poet. I like, there's some novelists I like. I like Alistair Gray's novels, not all of them, but some of them. You pick up different authors you get enthusiastic about, different years, you know. So, most of my work recently has been on Burns.
Excellent. Well, that's a great link into us starting to talk about Burns. So I'll pass over to Jim to start the conversation on that.
I'm assuming from what you just said, Patrick, that you're meeting, your first sort of involvement with Burns would be in Edinburgh. Would that be right? Really,
yes. I mean, if you think about it, my father never quoted Burns, right? Consciously. And, you know, odd bits are in the language. I mean, there's bits of Burns that you realize afterwards are Burns, which everyone has always said the whole of your life. And in grade school, we used to have these singing lessons, and there'd be Burns songs in the singing lessons, some of the old standards. And in high school, there was a Scottish club which did a Burns dinner, but of course I wasn't in that. In college, not many people did Scottish literature in English universities, though I did get to do Burns, you know, one assignment. In Leicester, when I was there, one of the senior people there was the Scottish poet George Fraser, G.S. Fraser. And I remember him talking to me about having been up to Greenock to do the Immortal Memory one time. You know, I used to talk with him. But really, it was Edinburgh before I started reading Burns for myself or knew much about him.
And apart from the academic side of this, how does his works affect you personally as an individual?
Well, really now it's very difficult to disentangle it all because, you know, I'm me, aren't I? And I am an academic, whether I want to be or not, you know. And so there are poems of his that I'm moved by, and poems of his I'm comforted by because they're very familiar, and poems of his that I admire because I can see their great achievements. And these are different kinds of impact on you, aren't they? But it's of course, there's an awful lot of poems, and I'm more familiar with some of them than others. I tend to, will buy a manuscript, or Ross will have had a manuscript, and I'll study that poem, and I get to like it a lot because I know it well. I think the same is true of people who are capable of memorizing poetry, that they memorize a Burns poem and they come to like it because they come to know it and appreciate it, and they come to see its relevance in different bits of life. I like poems where there's good quotable bits. And I think one of the great resources, other people have said this, of Burns, is that there's so many good phrases. You know, you don't have to know a whole poem to know bits of Burns which you can apply in life, which just, you know, just crop up again and again in life. The bits that get in the dictionaries of quotations, you know, they are great Burns, and they're one of the marks of him being a great poet, is that there are quotable bits which are applicable in all sorts of ways outside those poems.
Yeah, there's quite a few of them in the go. But you mentioned Grosh Roy, and he's held in great regard in Ayrshire. In fact, he's passing the Ayrshire Association of Burns Clubs, who have an annual quiz, decided that they would make a new trophy, and the quiz would be renamed the Grosh Roy annual quiz. And the trophy now has his name on it, and it's allocated every year to the winning team. Can you tell us a wee bit about Ross and what he was doing and how you interacted with him?
I was very surprised, really, to discover he was an honorary president of the Federation as long ago as 1977 or something. You know, he was born in Montreal in 1924, and he was Scots-Canadian. His one side of his family had been Jacobites, and he had an ancestor on the losing side at Culloden. And then they moved to Canada, I think with the army, and they were on the winning side on the Heights of Abraham when Quebec was taken with Wolfe. And they intermarried and settled there. The person in his family who influenced him most was his grandfather, who was a landscape gardener and was also a Burns collector. And he lived with his grandfather, Ormiston Roy, Willie Roy, for in the 1940s, after he came back from the Air Force. He went to Scotland with his grandfather in 1932, which was when they bought Burns's porridge bowl, which you know, is one of the trophies in the Burns room here. But so he learnt Burns young, and he was in the Air Force in the World War, and he came back from that and decided he would study literature and not botany, which is what he'd been doing. And he went to France, and he married a French wife, Lucy, in Strasbourg. And he came back, taught in Canada, and then went back to France to do a doctorate at Paris, which was what French Canadians often did. And he wasn't allowed to do it on Burns because they'd had a dissertation on Burns already in the 1890s. So he did it on French Canadian poetry or something. But after his grandfather died in 1959, he inherited his grandfather's Burns collection, which was maybe 1,500 books then. And he bought it and he expanded it, and it became his occupation. And he really hadn't worked on Burns till the 1960s. And he moved here in 65, and he founded the Journal of Studies in Scottish Literature, and he started his big project to edit the letters, to revise the Ferguson letters. And they took till 1985 to come out. That was his preoccupation for 25 years, really, off and on. And so when I came here in 76, he hadn't yet published that, but he was a well-known Burns scholar and a well-known Burns collector. And he didn't teach a lot. He was a full professor once he got here, and he taught 2 courses a week, you know, and one of those was his graduate course in an evening. But he edited the journal, and I got on very well with him. We lived very near. I'd go over, particularly as they got older. He retired in 1990, promptly when he hit 65. I retired at 66. I mean, you know, we didn't hang around. You can stay on. But he kept on editing the journal. He gave it up when he was over 80. And he died when he was 87, I think. No, 89.
I mean, his collection, I mean, his research and his, and, you know, just that interaction with the Burns movement has been great. And obviously, you're coming along. What collections have you got at university there? Just exactly.
Well, look, from the point of view of Scottish, right, he used to buy poetry and he used to make the library buy the novels, right? So between the two of them, we've got a lot of them. But it's pretty much comprehensive from 1707 onwards. It's not comprehensive before that, though he has some interesting stuff, but he's not into early manuscripts. From 1707 on, he has a great Allan Ramsay collection, a great Ferguson collection. He has a great Burns collection. We have between the novels and the poetry, we've got a great Scott collection, we've got a great Carlyle collection, we've got a great Stevenson collection. He knew Hugh MacDiarmid, he's got a great Hugh MacDiarmid collection, he knew a lot of other poets. So it goes up to it's not as good once you get to the 21st century, but up through the 1960s and 70s, it's really very good. And that's the main collection that I interacted with him. I first worked with him in detail, really, in 1990. He had just given the collection to the university, which at that point was about 5,000 or 6,000 volumes of Burns. And he had decided that he wanted to have a conference here. And he went to Aberdeen, and they didn't want to come here. They wanted to go to Oxford. And he persuaded them to come here by saying that he would charter a plane and fly them over for free. And he came home full of this great triumph. And later in life, I learnt to be wary when he said, "I've got something exciting to tell you, Patrick. You must come over and have a drink." So I went over, and this was unloaded on me. "You must help me get the money." Right? So I had to go to the university administration with him, knowing they would say no, right? And he would be disappointed. But eventually we got money out of the federal government, and we flew people here from 13 countries, and people came from 30 different states, and they all came and stayed for 3 days for free while we had this great medieval and Renaissance conference. And he edited a huge fat volume from it, and that in a sense put his collection on the map. And he never really looked back after that. You know, he was well known to Burnsians, both for when he was in Scotland. He used to go to Ken Simpson's conference, you know,
at Strathclyde.
Strathclyde conference. And he loved going to that. And he was in several of the volumes. He was a good friend of Ken. Ken used to visit here. And later Jerry would visit here, as Jerry Carruthers would visit here. And other people have. Several of the Federation presidents have visited here. Bill Dawson's been, Mike Dogood's been, and there have been others. I mean, you know, other people from the movement. Les Strachan from Virginia, who's big in Urbana, has been down here. And Urbana's met here twice, I think, and he's coming again in 2023.
Yes,
can I ask you, you gave us some great statistics earlier on when you said that his collection at the start was 1,500 books, and then you said that his Burns collection was between 5,000 and 6,000. What was the total collection? About
15,000 books.
Wow.
And one of the reasons he gave to the university was that he was going to have to give up his offices in the university, and it couldn't all fit in his house. But he still had a lot in his house, even when he died. He didn't have a Kilmarnock. When his grandfather died, his grandfather had owned a Kilmarnock in 1930s and had left it for safekeeping with someone in Britain when he got back here quickly in 1939. And he never recovered it after the war. And so Ross sold another collection, a Canadian literature collection, and bought himself a Kilmarnock in 1960 or 61, that sort of time. That's the sort of cornerstone. And he also bought some manuscripts, and we've bought manuscripts since. We've got about 40 Burns manuscripts, maybe 50 now actually, and we digitize them. And you can't just export manuscripts from Britain to here, right? If you bid on something at auction, people in Scotland, Scottish libraries, NLS, have about a month or 2 months if they want to buy it at the same price instead. You know, so you can't just take them. But most of the manuscripts we've bought have come from American owners, really. But we've got a good collection, some lovely ones. Some of them he bought way back, some of them we've bought more recently.
And you showed us some books you've got laid out there.
Yeah, well, it was really, actually, Jim knows about Ross, so I don't need to do it. I thought it would be a way of saying the thing he's really known for is his edition of the letters, right? And you'll probably have an older one in nice blue, but I had to buy it recently when I had to give up having the library one out forever. There's a catalogue of the collection of his books. I'm getting a reflection, aren't I? Which my successor at the library, Elizabeth Southeth, did, which is nice. I'm not selling these, let me tell you. This is informative. One of the best things he did, in '96, we did a big conference and he published all the papers with an Alistair Gray cover as a volume of SSL. And it's quite collectible now because they've all gone, right? He was a print man. Now it is all online, all the contents. And it has one of the most successful articles we've ever published, which was a man called Jim Montgomery from the Atlanta Club, who published an article on Burns in America. And that's one of the most successful articles we published, but the whole volume is about Burns. Mostly SSL is not, it's about something. Just before he died, he did this, which is about the letters of Clorinda. And it's a reproduction of the first one, you know, when it was pirated, before they all came out. And for his 80th birthday, we bought a letter of Clorinda to Burns. Those she rather edited and controlled. And we got that, and that was something that hadn't been published before, so we put that in. And he did, in about 63 or 64, he landed in London and he heard from a bookseller that there was a copy of the Merry Muses, of the original 1799 Merry Muses for sale. And Sidney Goodser Smith had found someone in a pub who had it, and it had got into the book selling trade. And he managed to buy it, and so he owned one of the 2 known copies of the 1799 Merry Muses, and his has a complete title page, which the Rosebery one didn't. So he's very proud of it. And for the bicentenary, he persuaded the University Press to do a facsimile. Now, I don't include any poems you can't get anywhere else, right? And it was very expensive. They overpriced it when it came out, but it's still a beautiful book, you know, and it's very nicely produced. And since then, a man from Canada called Stephen Brown was down here at a conference, and I persuaded, he was talking about the watermark in it and the dates, and would this prove who printed it? And we were able to find other books printed by the same printer, publisher, and work out that it was printed by William Smelly's son, Alexander Smelly. So we could, you know, and nobody really knew who printed it or where it came from, the 1799 one. So that was, you know, a really useful piece of discovery. It always shocks me. You know, there's 200 years of scholarship about Burns, of people knowing about Burns, and thousands of people knowing about Burns, and you can still find new things. You're not going to find earth-shaking things. It's not going to change which poems people think are most important, but it does alter. It's exciting to be able to do it after this length of time. And you know, now you've got new digital tools and things. You can do things you couldn't do before.
How about Burns in South Carolina? Is there an active Burns club?
Yeah. Well, there's as you know, American Burns clubs overlap with St. Andrews societies and Caledonian societies. Burns in America is very much part of Scottish, not so much Scottish expatriate as Scottish descent culture, sort of family, and they will have clan organizations and they will have Highland gatherings. The biggest is at Grandfather Mountain, but there's a number of them. The Burns Club there's a Burns Club in the town here, the Robert Burns Society, which has an annual dinner, and there's a St. Andrews Society, which has an annual dinner. They're not Burns oriented in the way a Burns Club in Scotland would be, right? They know about, so they will include people who know about Burns. The Burns Club that I have closest affiliation with is the Atlanta Burns Club, which has been going since 1896 and has its own cottage. In 1911, there was a Scottish stonemason who was a member, and they got plans and they built themselves a cottage, an exact replica, which is where they hold their monthly meetings. And they include a fair number of people who know about Burns. They will have talks on other things, but the backbone and spine of it all is talks about Burns. And I don't get over there very far because very often it's 200 miles each way, you know. And I used to go a bit more often. I used to drive Ross over because Ross, you know, they'd want Ross to give a talk, and we'd go, and we had good friends over there. The Frank Shaw, who did Robert Burns Lives, the online magazine, was a member there. There's a lot of good members over there, and they would come over here sometimes for events, and I go there once or twice a year, typically.
Can I just, I'm a Burns, those who know me know I'm a kind of Burns geek in many ways, but I adore Kinsley's work, and I was just wondering, what's your view on James Kinsley's works as an academic?
I think it's wonderful, but I mean, it does need rehauling. I mean, the shocking thing, if you think about it, is when I started knowing about Burns, one of the exciting things was that all the spade work had been done, right? There was a really good bibliography by Eggerer, there was a really good edition by James Kinsley, and there was a good edition of the letters by Ferguson, and Ross revised it, right? So the spade work, you could get at the documents in a way. And then there was the Chronicle. Once you got into it, there was all this stuff which was in the Chronicle from way back. But those are 50 years ago, right? Eggerer started work in the 30s and came out in 64 on the publication history. Ross started work in the 60s and finished in 85, but it was based on Ferguson, who started work in the early 1920s. And Kinsley was very efficient editor. I mean, he took only about 10 years to do that edition, right? Which is remarkable, really, when you think about it, because it's a masterly edition. Now, you don't have to believe all his commentary. He had a special interest in 17th and 18th century literature because he'd edited Dryden before, and he could see parallels I can't see. He'll tell you about another poem who Burns must be citing or referring. And I don't always believe those, but as a study, it's wonderful. It isn't complete on manuscript sources. And he's biased towards choosing a text from manuscript when very often nowadays you choose to print the text as Burns printed it. You know, you take it direct from the printing in the Kilmarnock or whatever. But so people could disagree with it, but it's monumental. I mean, it was an incredible step forward. Before that, if you go back to Scott Douglas and Henley Henderson and Chambers Wallace, they're good editions. There's a lot of good stuff. And there's 200 years of serious scholarship on Burns, you know, which is shocking. I mean, it's not like anything else I've ever worked on, you know, for the depth and variety. The trouble is finding out what people have said before. It's incredibly difficult to find out what's already known about Burns, you know, and Kinsley's notes are one of the best places to see.
Quelton Zoom and some Robert Burns. He uses that a lot as well. And I just think it's a great tool, and you can't get the editions now. I mean, I was fortunate, I got one from a library in New York.
Yeah, I bought it, and I took the chance of buying 2 volumes from one library, and I got the 3rd from another. And, you know, libraries are getting rid of books. It's a good thing for us all. But if you want to buy it, when Ross died, I had thought I would get his reference tools because, you know, he got multiple copies of things like Kinsley, and the main collection went to the library, but he was still working and he kept copies of Chambers Wallace and Henry and Henderson and Kinsley and Ferguson and things at home on his shelves, and his own edition of the letters. And his house was flooded. You know, the house was swept away completely in 2015. Lucy had to move into an apartment. And the books, which had been on the shelves in the study, when they were clearing after the flood, they went to the library, right? So the library had 2 copies and I didn't have one. So when I was working on, I did a documentary biography of Burns. You know, nobody needed a biography of Burns, but this series had never had a Burns volume, and it ought to have, and it's used by a lot of American public libraries in digital form. So when I was doing that, I had to buy all the books I needed to do my work. So I built a Burns library really very quickly. And it's possible nowadays with online searching in a way you couldn't. And I didn't spend that much money on it. But that was in 2016 and 17. I was buying those books. I'm involved with the Glasgow edition, and I think that they have really been the updating. I mean, they're the sort of central updating for building on what's been done before, because with digitization, you can find manuscripts which have gone astray, and you know no one knew where the manuscript of Red Red Rose had gone to that was known in the 1930s. And I found that maybe last year, was at the Lilly Library in Indiana. And there's a manuscript of Scots Wha Hae there that Kinsley didn't know where it was. And there's a manuscript of Auld Lang Syne, of the key added stanzas to Auld Lang Syne, which had been missing for a long time, since the 1920s, which is going to turn up in the Honresfield collection, if the Honresfield collection is adequately funded and comes to the National Library and to Alloway, as everyone hopes. And these are major poems, right? With manuscripts which had just disappeared, and you couldn't do much about it till digitization. And Glasgow is the sort of central clearinghouse for people putting this new information together.
Excellent. You're also involved in the editorial committee of the Chronicle.
I'm on that. I've really valued working with Bill while he's been doing it, and I'm on the board for the new one, the Edinburgh University Press one. And every now and then they'll send me an article and they say, "What do you think of this?" Right. Now they know what they think of it, right? So it's not me gatekeeping, it's me giving advice. And that it's useful that they can get people to give them advice. I mean, it's got to be a vectoring. You know, Bill and Jerry represent the 2 interests of that journal, right? Of the club membership and the academic one, which is important for the library subscriptions, that side's represented. And I think, and now it's online from the press with subscriptions, I think there'll be more academic subscriptions, and I think it'll help the Federation pay for it. I think it'll become not a drag, and it'll become self-sustaining over time. But and it's valuable having a journal like that for people outside Scotland. You know, we don't get to go to club events and conferences in Scotland, and the Chronicle has, you know, I've enjoyed it, and it's one of the best benefits I get from an individual membership. Let me tell you, you know, I like the newsletter that Mike Dogood puts out, and they do different jobs really. But I like the main editorial work I do though is for Studies in Scottish Literature, which is the journal that Ross founded in 1963. And he edited it till 2008. And then he shut it down and wrote this great plangent thing. You've got to know when to hold them. You've got to know when to fold them. I'm giving it up, you know, no one else can take over their stuff. And I knew he was going to do it. And then blow me, he turns around in 2010, we were sitting in a meeting with donors and he makes this big generous gesture. I have decided that the journal will go on, right? I will donate all rights in the journal to the university and Patrick will edit it. Now, it would have been nice if he'd asked me first, you know. But anyway, for the last 10 years, that's pretty much what I've done with half of my time. And it comes out, if I'm lucky, twice a year. And it's got a lot of articles. We've got over 100 articles in it, if you look back through the files. And we made it all free online. The same way that Bill did and Mike with the back numbers of the Chronicle, except that we don't, in fact, sell very many print ones. We still do print ones, but we don't sell very many of them. And I've done other projects. I've tended to do things with other people. We did Ross's selected essays as a little book, because he always said, I've given my life to editing the journal and nobody knows what I've done and no things. So we edited his essays and the oral biography he did of his life, and we put a bit of that in the front. And there was an expatriate Scot quantity surveyor called Alan Young in Florida, who'd visited up here to see Ross. People tended to come and see him. He was a friendly man and was working on tracking down all the copies of the Kilmarnock. And he came up here a couple of times and worked in the library with the reference sources and so on. And he talked at our conference in 2009 about this. And then nothing happened, right? He did a little article for Bill in the Chronicle when it was still a quarterly magazine. And people kept asking me, you know, what's happened to Alan's census account of the Kilmarnocks, right? Because he'd had it in mimeoed form. And an auction house in Scotland started quoting the mimeoed form, you know, which was only sort of halfway there. So I phoned him up and I said, you know, would you want me to publish it if we can finish it? And his wife had died, he'd been depressed and things. And I think he'd just given up for a bit. And he picked it up and we did it together. And that's been a very successful book, actually. I mean, it doesn't sell a lot, but I think people in the book trade and people in libraries and some Burnsians who are interested in that kind of thing have really liked the fact that there was an up-to-date record. And it has a record of all the earlier mentions of Kilmarnocks, of when, you know, sales in the 1860s and 70s and 80s and this sort of stuff, the sort of history of who owned it. So that's a specialized kind of research. So the sorts of things I do are different from what most Burnsians would do, right? I mean, they use my skills from way back, research skills from way back, and I'm not doing the same thing as other people. I'm doing the things that, not because I think they're more important, but because they're the things I can do, you know.
So if there's any Burn scholars out there listening to this, do you want them to get in touch with you if they've got any useful information?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, they're better to get in touch with Jerry at Glasgow, be more useful, you know, but yes, they should. Yes, they should.
Patrick, you mentioned earlier on that you love Burns's work for the ones that are more quotable, right? And I'm intrigued as to what would be some of your favourites. We've all got our own in Burns movement, you know. What are yours?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, right, everyone knows all the quotes which I was going to give you, right? But I have a thing in my head that there are poems which are great poems, which the critics have been down on, but which are really mainstream things and speak very much to people outside Scotland. And one of those is the Cottage Saturday Night, which the critics don't like particularly, but which people outside Scotland very much do. And people say it's a bit sentimental, but it's a remarkable poem. And I will contrast it with, you know, Thomas Gray and the country churchyard thinks all the people in the churchyard are mute, inglorious Miltons and roses blushing unseen, and they're lost, and, you know, village, you know, they're just locals, and he's different. And Goldsmith in The Deserted Village, about his old home in Ireland, thinks it's all over, it's gone. And Burns, all right, Burns has an outside perspective as well as an inside perspective on his father's home and their livelihood, but he identifies with it much more. And he speaks much more about the dynamics of that family. You know, as the father comes home and is having Saturday night worship, right? The dynamics in that group are really very acutely observed. And it's always struck me that the father comes home and they refer to him as their dad. And I don't think there's any other poem in English before the 20th century that refers to anyone as their dad. And it wasn't a specifically Scottish word, right? But Burns is picking out things from the life he lived, which other poets never picked out. And that's in one of the most formal poems that he wrote, quite an elaborate poem in Spenserian stanzas. Or John Anderson, My Joe, everyone says is incredibly sentimental, but it's a great poem, right? And nobody writes, really, they write about love, they write about, novelists write about unhappy marriage, but relatively few people write about old age or happy marriage. And Burns wasn't old when he wrote that, right? I mean, he was having to imagine it. He was having to empathize with it. And I think it's a great poem. Now, of course, and then there are poems which I recognize the greatness of for irrelevant reasons, like I Walking, about lying awake at night and remembering the dead loved one. A remarkable poem, but it resonates for me because Tennyson wrote a very similar poem, perhaps influenced by it, but a very similar poem, which is quite different. And you sort of see the directness of Burns because it contrasts with other poets. And I think, again, that's something that's a pleasure for me, which if you're just a Burnsian, or mainly a Burnsian, you're not as conscious of. But because I've spent so much of my career in other things, I see this about Burns, and that's, you know, that's one of the things that I see in Burns for me. But I recognize the greatness of it. It's in the same things that other people think are great, you know, A Man's a Man and Red, Red Rose and so on. These are the mainstream great poems.
That's excellent. And it's great to hear your perspective on that. And the fact that you're seeing something in some of these other poems that perhaps many in our audience have not seen. So it's great to hear that perspective. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, Patrick. So I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you very much for spending time with us and telling us about your life with Robert Burns. Thank you.
Thank you.